Excellent. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today. Brian Reardon with the S Corporation Association, and we've got our friends from the Winston Group, Myra and David, who, as you all know, have done a lot of work with us in the past, focus groups, polling, et cetera, on the issues important to Main Street. And today we wanted to circle back because they did a lot of work for us leading up to the debate and adoption of OB3, the big beautiful bill. And now we want to kind of roll back and take a look in a little bit of retrospect in terms of, okay, what was in the bill, what was good for Main Street, and how do the American voters perceive it? Because I think, as we all know, getting the bill done, step one, declaring victory and making sure people understand what you did. That's a very and just as important step two, right? So that's what we're going to focus on today. So with that, I will turn it over to our friends David and Myra to kick off their presentation.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody, and glad to be here. And this is sort of a fun presentation in the sense we get to walk through all the positive things that occurred as a result of this legislation. So this will be an enjoyable one. And also being an S Corp ourselves, it's more than just simply enjoying this with you. We'll also enjoy the benefits of this bill as well. So with that,
and we are going to make the slides available to everybody. So.
Yes. What I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through sort of a general overview of where the economic situation is at and kind of what emerged. Myra, who did all the hard work in terms of the analysis and getting the materials ready for Brian, so he could use, she'll walk through the substance part that I'm sure everybody wants to see. So I'm just start off with, we did a national survey middle of May, just in preparation for obviously all the legislative sessions that came through in terms of in terms of getting this all the way to the finish line. And one of the elements that exist here is people's attitude about the direction of the country is still negative. 40% say it's right direction, 50% say wrong track. And what's occurring there is inflation has clearly improved, but the last month we saw a little bit of an uptick. We saw it go from 2.4%, and this is the overall consumer price index from BLS. It went from 2.4 to 2.7. So there was a slight uptick, still down from the 3% back in January, but nonetheless, people are still concerned about it. Having said that, when you ask, do you think inflation is getting better or worse? Oddly, this is a better number. Worse have been up over 50% for a long time. It's now below 50%, but what you can also see is still there's a significant concern. Only 27% think it's better as opposed to that 49%. And the reason they think it's getting better is what you're looking at here is something that Myra and I do, where we take a look at the cumulative price increase based on the CPI of where Trump is now currently and where Biden was at the same point in his administration. And what you see is by June of Biden's first last term, he was already at prices had already gone up a total of 3.9%. Trump's at 1.5%. So people have sort of seen that there's clearly an improvement. But the challenge here is looking at how does this compare with wages? And again, that blue line is the inflation number going up to 1.5%. I'm using weekly wages as the contrast. And what you can see is weekly wages are still pretty close to inflation above it, which, by the way, during Biden's entire term, inflation was always higher than the accumulated weekly wages. And so, but it's still close. And so there's this sense of we need to see more space between wages and inflation to sort of make up for our ability to meet cost of living. And that's what a key part of the big beautiful bill was generating that economic growth. And a key part of that was the pass-through provisions that were in place in terms of that bill that the legislature, Congress, and the Senate think, in fact, are going to help that. The other element here that we learned out of the whole negotiating process in terms of the big beautiful bill, people are still more focused in terms of government spending being the bigger problem in terms of the deficit than not enough revenue coming in from taxes, right? And that existed prior to this whole discussion. one of the things that emerged in terms of the negotiating process is basically anything that can generate revenues is on the table. So all those successes we just had, don't think that when we get to the next reconciliation bill that all that can be back on the table. And so one of the big challenges here to Brian is managing that process when we get to that again, because it will occur. And just to give you a sense of the scale of challenge, if you take a look at the CBO score at the beginning of January, discretionary spending, the deficit was larger than discretionary spending. So if you wiped out all of discretionary spending, we'd still be running a debt. And so as we go through this process again, people think government spending is a bigger deal, but all revenues be on the table. And so there's still many challenges in front of us. But with that, let me hand this off to Myra and she can go through all the elements of what we just went through. Myra?
Well, I'm going to go through the three of the pass-through provisions that were in the tax bill debate, the 199A tax increases on high-income earners and SALT parity. And these are sort of in, I would say, easiest to the hardest, with that last SALT parity being probably the most challenging of the three. That context that David just went through with you, particularly that last slide about spending versus revenue, were important context for how we had to position each of the three. So having this data to take on each of these provisions was so important, and being able to deal with each in sort of a unique way. And so I'm going to go through each of these to go through what was the strategy and the data that we had behind each of these. So I'm going to start with 199A, and there were three factors in the Hill environment, and this is not going to be a surprise to people on this call that the fiscal outlook has increased the focus on finding revenues and savings. So that's gotten more challenging that way. There's institutional turnover and a learning curve on many of the pass-through issues, and then we've seen a heightened engagement from opponents. So it was I would say, an even more challenging Hill dynamic this time than it was in 2017, and those were factors we're going to have to deal with for a long time to come. So let's start with 199A, and I want to start with this quote from Leader Thune on July 1st about how he was saying that we're on the business side of what we just did in the tax bill, that we're setting the stage for economic growth as the overarching goal, and it means lower effective tax rates for small and medium-sized businesses and the job-creating 199A small business deduction. And this is I think, a testament to the long time work of the S Corporation Association, that the leader of the United States Senate is calling the 199A deduction a job creating deduction. So I think that's sort of a great standard that we've set there. And so this one was in a lot more solid footing than I think the other two provisions. So in this survey that we did for you all, we provided this description of what the 199A tax deduction is and asked people, did they favor or oppose it? And consistent with the research that we've done for you all in the past, we found that this is a concept that people get, that 60% favored this deduction, and anything that will help small and family-owned businesses continue to succeed is something that people support. We tested a variety of statements about 199A and found that, again, people really grasped what the 199A does in real terms. So that first statement about help small businesses maintain employment, wages, health insurance, and retirement plans. And if it's eliminated, it will have a huge impact on the employees. 65% believe that. And you can see in this chart what it was across party. The second statement about businesses are still recovering from the COVID pandemic, inflation, labor shortages. So making this permanent will help these businesses make it through. That was another strong statement at 61%. And then that last statement about helping level the playing field between large corporations and small businesses, that was another strong statement. So again, people grasp this concept pretty easily. And I want to play this next clip is from some focus groups that we did for you all at the end of 2023. And you're going to be able to hear how people were discussing 199A. And this is going to start with David posing the question, what happens if 199A is eliminated?
If this expired, what do you think the impact would be?
I think it would hurt a lot of small businesses.
And every little bit helps, and this 20% could make them or break them.
So again, this is one that people were able to grasp. So the next one, tax increases on high income earners. This one was slightly more challenging. It came up several times in the tax debate. We had an incident over a weekend, Brian, there toward the end of the House process where some of the SALT caucus, they were bringing up letting the top rate go up to pay for other items. Fortunately, that was batted down, but it's something that does come up more. And so as the search for pay-fors continues, we're going to need to continue addressing this. So some of the data that we wanted to provide as context for this, and one of them was this backdrop of inflation that David was bringing up. With the country still dealing with inflation, now is not the time to raise taxes, with 62% believing that. And then another belief that we've had to reinforce many times people get is the idea that if companies have to pay more in taxes, that those costs will be passed on to consumers in higher prices at 70%. And then the idea that tax increases, are these inevitable, that because of what's happening with the solvency of Social Security and Medicare, that, well, this is an inevitable something in our future. By 2-to-1, people don't believe that, because as David was pointing out, that very lopsided focus on the government spending problem over the revenue problem, voters' attitude is you have to deal with the spending side of this first before we should take money from small businesses and individuals to feed the spending problem. We haven't ruled it out necessarily, but focus on the spending side first. So these were some contextual items to this debate over tax increases.
Hey, Myra, can we go back one? I'm sorry to interrupt, but can we go back to the previous slide here? One more. Yeah, this one. When we were fighting, the 70% one there. Go forward
the
one.
next one about the passing on.
Yeah, so when we were fighting the 40% top rate, et cetera, I think this was one of our more compelling arguments, which is, when you talk to voters and taxpayers, if you're talking about raising taxes on employers, raising taxes on businesses, they instinctively understand that, those costs are going to get passed along to somebody, right? And, the economist in me will say, well, it'll get divided between the owners and the customers and the suppliers. But at the end of the day, it's the customers that are going to end up paying a big part of that, and in the form of higher prices, right? And I think that was one of our more compelling arguments that helped us beat back that higher top rate that people were talking about. Sorry about that.
That's okay. And even with the, as David was showing, the trending on the CPI, even though inflation has moderated from that peak in summer of 2022, there is very much a hangover effect in terms of the overall price increase that is well over 20%, that people are still carrying that. And so what would add on top of that, that is something that particularly a Republican Congress wants to avoid. So we repeated this set of questions that we've done before on what people think that entities are paying, and then what is the maximum tax rate that they should be paying. And this was very interesting and useful to making these arguments. So the wealthy individuals, you can see that, well, for all of these, it's lower than the rates that they're currently paying. So for the wealthy, an open-ended answer was 21%, the rate they're paying. So what's the top rate? 34.9. So the point that we made was that what the maximum top rate that even the wealthy, however that's interpreted, should be paying is still lower than what it would be if that top rate were allowed to expire. And small and family.
Can I
Yep.
just jump in here? Because just to clarify, so for wealthy individuals, the 21%, that reflects respondents' views on how much do they currently pay? How much are they paying right now? And you can see that they're, as you pointed out, vastly underestimating how much they're paying. The one thing that strikes me is how, with the small family-owned businesses, they overestimate how much they're paying, and they think they should be paying less. That's very interesting. Obviously, small and family-owned businesses pay higher rates than that, as do the wealth.
Right. So there's an ongoing challenge with knowledge about what entities are currently paying. And Brian, as you flagged that last one about small and family owned, voters think that they should be paying less than they are now. And so even the current rate, I think most people would be thrilled to pay that. But there is a serious gap between what people think they're paying, what they actually are. But then what is the maximum they should be paying? Even for however you define the wealthy, is going to be lower than what the top rate would have been if that had been allowed to expire. So again, who are the high income earners? When you ask this as a standalone, raising the top rate on high income, there is openness to that. However, when that is clarified that this would also apply to small and family-owned businesses. There is a significant drop in support for that, and people oppose that, particularly Republicans. So we have to always reiterate that when you talk about the top rate, you're going to be hitting the small and family-owned. And so back to those earlier questions relevant to 199A, people very much believe in small and family-owned businesses. So anything that's going to help them succeed is something that we support. Now, SALT parity, this is the most challenging of the three. Turned out well, but it was a challenge and is going to continue to be a challenge. So the data that we needed to establish for this was, again, about the backdrop of inflation, and now is not the time to raise taxes. But actually, in principle, this was something people did grasp better than I thought they might. Also, another question we used here was 70%. We need to do everything we can to help businesses get back on their feet so they can get Americans back to work to keep the economy moving in the right direction. People do believe that there is a hangover effect of COVID. Inflation's still a problem. We don't need to do anything right now that is going to harm small and family-owned businesses. We need to help get them stood up. So this is how we described the SALT parity, that in 36 states, the business owners of small and family-owned businesses are able to deduct the cost of state, local, and property tax as business expenses. And it's something that people got. 68% favored this tax deduction. It just made sense to people. And then when Congress was considering eliminating or limiting the tax deduction, there was some opposition to that. Again, it's a new concept to most people. It's not as well defined, but at face value, it was something that people thought could have a harmful effect. So we looked again at the beliefs behind this. So these are just 3 examples. And in looking at our messaging on this, this was a new topic that we've taken on for S Corp. We had not done this one before. I took a look at many of your member statements and the letters that you've submitted because I wanted to bring in the testimonials of what the real world impact is of what your members are saying. So I folded a lot of this into the statements and it seemed to work well. Top example, small and family-owned businesses should be putting this revenue back into their businesses for the employees rather than giving it to the federal government to spend. Again, playing into that spending problem rather than a revenue problem. 71% of voters believe that. Another example, if this tax deduction is eliminated or limited, that it would be a tax increase. And this was a very important point to make for Republicans. And people did make the connection between this deduction going away and this translates into a tax increase. So this was a really important point. And then the third statement about limiting or eliminating this deduction would harm businesses. It would weaken our competitiveness. It reduce investment and harm workers. Again, people got that. So the good news is they were able to translate that concept into a tax increase and to what the real world impact is on the businesses and the employees. Should business partnerships receive the same treatment as corporations? 59% in this example said yes. However, when you take this a step farther and say, should small and family-owned businesses receive the same treatment? 82% said that they should. So anything that we can describe in the context of small and family-owned is always something that we want to do. And I want to end here with a tweet from a Punch Bowl reporter when everything, it was a late breaking development, but what a huge win this was for all of our allies. I wanted you all to see this, that the Republican plan to entirely drop the new limits on the SALT deduction. She called it a huge, all caps, huge win for business groups fighting the crackdown. So late breaking development, but it was a huge win. So everybody should be very pleased with that outcome. So what's next though? We had a lot of really great wins here, but as Winston Churchill said, this is not the beginning of the end, it's the end of the beginning. So we have to protect the gains that we make, but there's still a lot of work ahead. And as we've seen, particularly on the more challenging elements like the tax increases and SALT parity, we had to be able to act quickly and have data that would help speak to that, as opposed to we're in a scramble, got to throw a coalition together and some ads. We were right there at the ready to be able to address all of these. And this is, again, just a testament to the great work that Brian, Alex, and all of you are doing all year round. So some ideas on what's coming next. Defining what businesses are doing with the tax revisions. We saw in 2017, after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act passed, that most of the allies more so on the corporate side than the pass-through side, just moved on and to, okay, what are the tax fixes they wanted? And they didn't really talk about the benefits that were coming from that. And I think that caused a lot of problems with perceptions of that bill. So we want to make sure that that doesn't happen this time. So anything we can do to talk about what pass-through businesses are doing as a result of those newly renewed tax provisions will be a great thing to help down the road. Second thing is just an educational learning curve. How pass-through businesses work, how do provisions like salt parity, what's the real world impact? We have institutional turnover happening here at an unprecedented scale. So we have that ongoing education learning curve. And Brian, as you were pointing out, the knowledge gap between what entities are actually paying and what people think they pay. So that's another example. 199A 2.0, where do we go after this? Brian, I know you've been working on some ideas for that, so there will be more coming there. And then finally, building our bench of champions. We've had long-standing individuals in Congress who have been champions for the pass-through community. Some of those are retiring. We need to raise up new champions at the individual and staff level. So these are just some suggestions on where we go next after this. So with that, Brian, I will turn it back over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Myron. Thanks, David. That's extremely helpful. If we can go back to the last slide there, keep that on.
I just pulled it in.
Yeah. Because I do think that, you know, one of the challenges with these sorts of efforts is, you know, we spent 8 years building a foundation to get where we got in the OB3 here. And now that it's done, it's like, oh, okay, you know, moving on. It's like, yeah, no, now you have to make sure that people know what you did and why it's good for the economy, good for workers. And two, you have to build on that and you know, continue to engage. And that's kind of what, you know, in my mind, the 199A 2.0 is, you know, certainly there are opportunities to improve 199A. I'd love to get rid of the SSTB designation and some of the other things. But it's also, if, you know, to the extent that you have a bill like that, it creates a vehicle that allows you, it gives you an excuse to go into offices in the House and the Senate and educate people on what are pass-throughs, what's the small business deduction. By the way, folks, if you want to ask a question, use the Q&A function at the bottom. We've got a couple questions here. And one of them is exactly to that point, which is, many people surveyed, do many people surveyed know what 199A, what's the best way to describe the provision? And obviously, I agree with the sense that, you know, referring to a section of the tax code is not the best way to brand, you know, the provision. There's lots of, we use small business deduction, pass-through deduction, family business deduction. All of those things apply. I'm not sure, Myra and David, have we done any work on what's the best way to refer to 199A?
I had those belief statements about it that I'll be sure and pass on. But the more that we can bring in that real world impact of what small businesses are able to do, help put that money back into their businesses. It helps provide health insurance, wages, and benefits for employees. That's what we always want to be reinforcing. And also that it helps level the playing field somewhat with large corporations. So it's benefits of the deduction, not just the deduction that exists.
And if I can add to that, when we were doing the focus groups, the idea that somehow small business was being helped, and so that 20% they perceived as helping and it mattered, that was the way to describe it. As 199A, to the questioner's point, yeah, they didn't have any idea what that was. But the idea of 20%, they viewed that as a very positive, helpful thing for small business.
Excellent. Yeah. Another question is, lots of media reports about how OB3 is underwater, polls badly. Any truth to that? And how much is that due to tax policy versus Medicaid cuts? Certainly, I think the focus of the opposition on the Medicaid cuts has had an impact, but I do think this speaks to the larger challenge, which is even in 2017, one of the challenges that we have with President Trump is we got the bill done, and then I don't remember him ever talking about it ever again, including, you know, in the reelect effort. And, having worked for W back in the aughts, one of his strengths was message discipline. That after we got done with the 2001 bill and the 2003 bill JTRA, we didn't just drop it. He went around the country every week. We did an event around the country where we were talking to businesses, talking to families about the benefits that they were seeing now that the bill had been enacted and they were actually seeing tax relief in their returns. We need to do a similar focus this time around. And I think, Trump 2.0, I think, is much more disciplined, much more focused. And now that they've got this bill done, part of the challenge will be to discuss what we just discussed, right? Here are the provisions that poll really well. Here are the provisions that people really like. They're in the bill. They're going to help businesses. And, you guys know, and the folks that are on the call here, my members are challenged with higher tariffs. They're challenged with all sorts of, economic and other types of uncertainties out there. The fact that we got this bill done is a big, big benefit because it takes one level of uncertainty and the threat of significantly higher tax levies off the table. And now they can, move forward with one less thing that they have to worry about. And that means that they can be more assertive in hiring people and increasing their investment levels, et cetera. And that's all to the good. And that's, I think, it's good for the economy. It's one of the reasons that the voters like it, as your poll numbers show. And it's got to be something that people are talking about. Because if they're not talking about it, we're going to end up, just like we did in 2017, with a very good tax bill that nobody likes and doesn't resonate with voters. And it should.
Well, Brian, you were talking about the example of the Bush years. Also, with those tax cuts, there was a physical check that came in the mail. So people had something tangible to show for it. It was very smart. In 2017, by that time, most people were getting direct deposit. And so most people got a tax cut from that and they didn't realize it. Our work has shown that the bill is more undefined at this point, rather than necessarily negative, although Democrats are on a mission to define it negatively. And if Republicans and allies don't step in to have a proactive effort to define it, then Democrats will do it for them. And they will define it all in the context of healthcare, because they know that what happened in 2018 when that election became all about pre-existing conditions, that was in part because Republicans were not able to leverage that tax bill and the success of the economy into a campaign issue. And so that's what we have to do in terms of a proactive effort. So I think it's more undefined at this point, but opponents will define it if allies don't step in.
Yeah, if we're not out there filling the void, then the people who don't like the bill will do it, and they'll give it a bad name, right?
And if I can add one more thing to this, I mean, that question, that is actually the key strategic question in terms of setting up the context for the 2026 election. Because again, if Democrats can define it as something else besides the economic benefits that occurred in terms of the tax cuts, and it's all about Medicaid cuts, they basically win the argument, like Myra said, as what happened in 2018. Healthcare ended up being the #1 issue as opposed to the economic side. So, and to your point, Brian, that sort of Trump 2.0 is a little bit more disciplined. He has his moments, but he's a little bit more disciplined. And I think there's a general understanding that now that this piece of legislation is there are two elements to this. One, the legislation has to do what we hope it will do, which we think it will do in terms of growing the economy. But once that begins, the execution of, in fact, making sure that people are aware of those benefits is very critical. And so I would suggest whoever posed this question, yeah, you're right at the key strategic dynamic in terms of what we're looking at.
Yeah, exactly. Another question is on inflation. Even with CPI down, those scars are long lasting when it comes to opposing future tax hikes, or will people forget how strongly they felt in, say, 5 or 10 years? My experience with inflation is it's one of the more potent drivers of voter belief and how people vote, right? So, I go back and we're contemporaries. So going back to the Reagan, right? One of the reasons we had the Reagan Revolution in the first place was the massive amounts of inflation that we had under first Nixon and then Carter. And that resulted in tax reform, right? And here we saw, a change in the administration. I think in large part because of the inflation. And I think one of the things that observers, commentators on inflation miss, and your numbers get to it, which is when we talk about the incremental increases in inflation, even if those increases go down month to month, it's still resting on a very high level of increase over, say, the last 2 years or 3 years. And so people, when people say inflation's down, they go to the grocery store. No, it's not. I'm still paying really high prices for eggs and all the other things that I'm trying to get. Well, that's because, the prices there's a new floor, right? And so it's not like the inflation suddenly goes away, that you have deflation and eggs go back to where they used to be. It doesn't work that way. So that's part of the challenge, is that once you get inflation fears into the mindset of consumers and voters, really, really hard to squeeze those out. And I do think that those concerns are going to be long lasting. I don't know. What do you think?
I think it could, well, yes, but I do think it's a double-edged sword a bit, because Brian, as I mentioned to you last week, in this last tax debate, we did hear discussions about, paying taxes, somebody else's responsibility. People who make their wages through tips shouldn't have to be taxed. What about Social Security? What about overtime? Like, these people are struggling. Okay, we should take them out of the tax pool. And I worry that we are getting away from, we need to be broadening the base of taxpayers, not putting it
Right.
as someone else's responsibility to carry the nation's tax burden. So yes, inflation will continue to be a challenge, and there's a hesitation to raise taxes, but at the same time, I think we are getting away from, we need to broaden that base out, not make it someone else's responsibility.
The thing I would add to that, one generally, the two big items that will create significant change, one is unemployment, and we saw that happen in 2010, where you had a 63-seat pickup by Republicans as a result of Obama taking us over 9% unemployment, which, by the way, lasted for 30 months. You had, Brian, to your point, going back to Reagan, you had the combination of both unemployment and inflation at the same time, which was just creating huge problems. But what occurred here, and I think people need to realize what the 2024 election was about, ultimately, under doing that same CPI thing I did, if you look at Biden's full 4 years, prices went up 21.4%. Wages ended up going up about 5% less than that. So think about that huge gap. And people were just trying to manage that. And the challenge they were having is every month, where were they going to get more money? Their wages weren't coming up. And so how were they supposed to handle that? And I'm telling you that has a very searing effect on people. And they don't want to see that happen again. And the other challenge around inflation, why I think it'll be a little bit more long lasting, will it be 10 years? 10 years may be sort of reaching the sort of maximum, but certainly within 5 years, is that most people haven't had to go through inflation like we saw in the early 80s. So this was also just a completely brand new economic experience that was pretty devastating for a lot of families.
Yeah, I think it came as quite a shock when they saw how much prices were going up. Absolutely.
I will also add real quick, President Biden and Democrats ran into many problems with trying to sell his economic agenda, and there were many statements that voters did not believe. At the same time, that doesn't mean that voters are going to automatically believe everything Republicans say about this bill. So there needs to be I think a happy medium of making sure that we do sell progress from the bill, but that there's not this view that, well, inflation is fine now. And so we find ourselves out of touch with those voter concerns. So selling the progress and all the good things that we think are happening, but still being mindful of voters are still carrying these high prices.
Hey,
Agreed.
Brian, can I go to one point? Because I see this question from Ben Brubeck, and I want to specifically address this one because this is sort of a big deal. For those, he posed the question, how effective is the GOP talking point that Democrats voted against this bill and voted for the largest tax hike in history? That's actually not particularly effective because a lot of voters view that as hyperbole, largest tax cut. Okay, you're giving what the key thing, and we tested this, was when you can talk to somebody about how this specifically would have been a tax increase for them and what that tax increase looked like. So for example, in some of the work we've done, we took a look at the standard deduction as part of the, talking to individuals. And once they realized that for a married couple, that was $30,000. So if you were at $50,000, right, that meant you only had to deal with taxable income of $20,000, right? That was one thing, but if that was going to get cut in half, all of a sudden you had all this money on the table that was now taxable. Where were you going to get money to be able to cover those taxes? And some people even worked through the process because they were a little bit higher income of tax bracket creep, so that suddenly they might find themselves in higher tax brackets. So the key thing here is not, this is the largest ever. What needs to be done is make it personalized so people understand what we just did for them. And when we did it that way, there was overwhelming support in terms of, no, this is a great direction to go.
Excellent. Good point.
Dave, just pointing out, voters do tend to be skeptical of statements coming from either side about this is the largest in history or this is the single cause of the national debt. They're just not sure about that. But what they do believe is in the inertia of taxes continuing to go up unless something is done. So anytime we can tap into the beliefs that voters have, the stronger your messaging is going to be.
All right, we've got one last question here, which is, what's the best way to message the fact that for most taxpayers, it's kind of status quo, right? We avoided a big tax hike on families and past their businesses, but for most of them, next year they'll be paying effectively the same amount they paid this year. It's obviously, for me, that's a win because we did avoid the tax hike and we did provide certainty with the permanence of the provisions. But if I'm if I'm the small business guy out there, I'm like, well, okay, next year I pay the same amount I paid this year, okay. How do you message that?
This gets back to our fundamental belief in terms of our policy direction and our policy principles, and that is we believe what we just did will in fact grow the economy, and if the economy grows, then that's the argument and the proof. So have some faith in our policies.
Well, the fact something like 199A, again, I'd take it back to what impact that will have on small businesses, what they're going to be able to do with that, putting it back into their businesses for wages, for employees, for health insurance, and the real world impact. So, because if they'd gone away, they wouldn't be able to do those things next year. And many of them would have been going out of business as a result. So even if it is a continuation of present policy, we shouldn't shy away from talking about what the practical impact will be for that.
And I just view it as, two sides of the same coin, which is if you're looking at in the policy baseline a massive tax hike and you avoid that, then you compare the behavior of businesses next year to how they would have behaved if they were facing that tax hike, right?
Right.
And they, you can talk to my members. They were looking at, okay, we're going to have to pay back here, we're going to have to pay back there. We're going to have to come up with money somehow to pay these taxes. It's got to come from somewhere. It means wages, less investment. And so I think that's the true comparison that you have to make. And it's a valid one. And I think people get it.
And if I may go by given where things were generally going, I mean, what people forget is the amount of revenue that got generated by the 2017 tax cuts in terms of, and in terms for the federal government was huge. I mean, there was like, going from, I believe, from 20 to 22, we saw $1.5 trillion increase in the revenues. Okay, so we know this works. Part of the element here is it's not just simply there was no change. It was we didn't do something detrimental to the economy, and we know that that bill actually did help begin to grow the economy. Now that we have somebody who's not spending their brains out, and we have something under control, then we should see this growth in the economy.
Yep.
And to the slide, in terms of the slides that I'm going to make available, there are two with the belief statements. So for 199A, those 3 believable statements, and then for SALT parity. So hopefully that will help provide everybody with some messaging guidance there.
Excellent. So thank you for the slides. Thank you for the presentation. We will be posting both the webinar and the slides on our website later today. So be on the lookout for that. Thanks to everybody for joining. This has been super terrific. And you guys have been good partners for many, many years. And we appreciate all your hard work on this and the perspective that you bring, because not all folks in your world are bringing the same perspective and sort of I think our value systems are aligned here. So it's been nice working with you all. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody.